The Marathon des Sables, or the Marathon of the Sands, has been called the most difficult and intense foot race on Earth. This 6-day ultramarathon covers 156 miles, and it takes place in southern Morocco, which is located in the Sahara Desert. This desert spans 3.6 million square miles, and it is known for its intense heat, with surface temperatures reaching a staggering 180 degrees Fahrenheit or 82 degrees Celsius. This grueling multi-stage marathon is a test of endurance in one of the world's most inhospitable environments, incredibly dangerous, and a man by the name of Mauro Prosperi seen it as the epitome of the greatest adventures. He knew that he absolutely had to participate in it. However, what he didn't know was that it was an adventure that would bring him closer to death than he could have ever imagined. So if that sounds interesting and you like this story, then make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons and turn on all of the notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. And if you are curious about any of the things I've used in today's video, you can find the link to them in the description box below. Okay, let's begin. In 1994, Italian police officer and former Olympic pentathlete Mauro Prosperi was looking to push his body to its physical limits. At the time, he was 39 years old and married with 3 young children. He loved his family and his career, but he found that over the years, he was slowly becoming bored with his daily routine. He wanted something to spice up his life a little bit, something to give him a sense of adventure. And so when he learned about the incredibly difficult ultramarathon, the Marathon des Sables, he was immediately hooked. He knew at that very moment this is what he was looking for, and he was going to compete later that year. So he started training immediately, running 40 kilometers or 25 miles every single day. And each day he would reduce the amount of water he was drinking so that he would get his body used to being dehydrated, because this ultramarathon just happened to take place right in the middle of the Sahara Desert. His wife Cynthia recalled how he was never home anymore because he was constantly training for this marathon. She thought he was totally insane, believing that the race was far too risky, especially after she learned that Mauro had to fill out a form stating where he wanted his body sent in the event that he died during this marathon. This form was in place because the conditions of this marathon really were so dangerous and physically demanding that people could actually end up dead. After months and months of intense training and preparation, it was finally time for Mauro to hop on a flight and head to Morocco, where the race was set to begin. And when he got there and the race was ready to begin, he lined up with the rest of the runners at the start of the line, and as the official counted down from 10 to 1, off they went on their 6-day run through the Sahara Desert. The first 3 days that Mauro had been running, nothing of significance happened. The temperatures were exceedingly hot, oftentimes approaching 105 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Celsius. He was cautious about how much water he was drinking, making sure to ration the water that was provided to him each day, and all in all, everything seemed to be going quite well. Back in 1994, there were only roughly 134 competitors taking part in this marathon, and that meant that oftentimes the racers spent a lot of time alone, simply because there was just so much distance between each of them. And this was particularly true for Mauro, because he found himself alone for the vast majority of his journey. Now, the 4th day of the marathon is the longest single stage of the race, which comprises of a 57-mile stretch through the desert between campsites. The campsites are where the runners would spend the night after completing the scheduled leg of the marathon for that day. It was a way to make sure everyone had a safe place to spend the night, and it also served as a way to make sure that all of the runners were accounted for. On this day, April 14th, 1994, the temperatures took a turn against the runners and soared to a sweltering 115 degrees Fahrenheit or 46 degrees Celsius. Mauro, looking up at the sun, resigned himself to the punishment that the sun was about to lay upon him. He then picked up his allotted 2-liter ration of water and continued running towards the third checkpoint, which was 20 miles into the longest leg of the race. Things were progressing very smoothly for Mauro. He was happy with how his race was going. He was rationing his water and he was dealing with the heat as best he could, but shortly after 1 p.m., things took a drastic turn for the worse, and Mauro was about to find himself in very real danger. The winds picked up violently, viciously blowing the Sahara sand around, and Mauro suddenly found himself in the middle of an unexpected sandstorm. High winds whipped the vast amount of desert sand in the air, causing extremely poor visibility. The sand was getting in the runner's eyes, it was hard to see, it was hard to breathe, and so the race was paused for the remainder of that day. But the racers still had to make it to the 4th checkpoint by nightfall, and after waiting out the storm, that's where they headed. But Mauro had not made it to the 4th checkpoint. Mauro had disappeared. When the sandstorm started to blow, Mauro lost sight of everybody else in the race, and so he just continued running because he thought he could still see the trail, and he knew that he was in 7th place, and stopping would risk losing his position, and he didn't want that to happen. By the time the winds let up and the sandstorm had died down, it was nearly dark, and after a few minutes of seeing the area around him clearly, without the sand blowing nonstop in his face, it occurred to Mauro that he had lost the trail. He backtracked for hours looking for any sign of the trail, but soon it became too dark to continue searching, and so he set up a small camp with the intention that in the morning, first thing, he would search for the trail again and get back on track with his race. But unfortunately for Mauro, at first light he discovered that he had absolutely no idea where he was. Not one thing looked familiar. He had gotten totally turned around, and to make things worse, he had almost no food or water left to survive on. So he sat on the sand dune that entire day waiting to be rescued, thinking to himself that they had to have noticed that he was missing by now, and it was protocol to stay in one spot if you found yourself lost. So that's what he did. He sat and he waited, and then he waited some more. And then suddenly, to his delight, late that afternoon he heard it. And then he could see it. The rescue helicopter was almost directly over top of him. He was so excited and relieved to finally be out of this mess that he jumped around and waved his arms to get their attention. But the helicopter didn't stop. It didn't see him, and it just continued flying past, and Mauro watched as it disappeared over the horizon. The next day, he gathered up his things, deciding that he better just start walking again because waiting in one spot didn't seem to be working, and he was not interested in waiting there to die without even trying to survive. So off he went. And after walking for some time in the blazing heat with the sun beating down on him, he looked out across the desert and noticed some buildings far off in the distance. Seeing these buildings gave him a surge of hope because he thought that maybe they just might offer some salvation. And so hopeful that there was some water available and people that could help him out with his dire situation, he quickly made his way over to the structures. However, once he arrived there, he could now see that the buildings turned out to be nothing more than an abandoned tomb, and although there was no chance of being rescued here, he was at least able to get out of the blazing sun a little bit and rest in some shade. At this point, Mauro had no water left, and he was desperate. Looking around for something to drink, he noticed the rocks around him were covered in dew, so quickly he scooped them up and started licking the moisture off of them. He also remembered that he had some wet wipes in his bag, and knowing that they had moisture in them, he began sucking the liquid out of them as well, and then, when all of those options were exhausted, he resorted to drinking his own urine. And just like his water ran out, eventually his food ran out as well. So Mauro resorted to catching and eating the beetles that ran past him. As he was laying there in the shade munching on his beetles, he began looking around and he could see that on the inside of the tube, lizards and bats were also living in there, escaping the hot desert sun. and Mauro seen this as an opportunity to sustain himself a bit longer. He got up from his spot where he was laying, and after a bit of patience and stalking, he managed to capture some of the bats and lizards, and then he proceeded to eat them raw. He ate them raw because he thought if he cooked them, then the moisture that was in the meat would be cooked away, and then he wouldn't be able to consume it. And he was desperate for hydration of any means. A little while later, as he was laying there eating his bats and feeling just a little bit better, another plane flew overhead. Mauro jumped up and frantically tried to signal to it desperately by lighting a small fire and writing SOS in the sand. But again, the plane didn't seem to notice any of these signals from the ground designed to attract its attention and just continued on past him. By this point, Mauro believed that he had exhausted all of his options. He was drinking the blood of bats to survive, and that wasn't going to sustain him for very long. He was distraught, feeling helpless, and totally defeated. And so, at this point, he was ready to end his life. And with that thought, he took his knife out of his pocket, opened up the blade, and cut into his own wrist. And then he lay down and waited to die. But by some miracle, death didn't seem interested in him at that point, because amazingly, it would turn out that he was so dehydrated that his blood coagulated and would not flow out of the cuts that he had made in his wrists, and this ultimately prevented his death. In a last-ditch attempt to survive and reach the trail, Mauro left the safety of the tomb and started moving towards the mountains in the distance, believing that that was the most likely place that the trail would be. As he passed by dry riverbeds, he squeezed liquid from plant roots, and then, after 8 days in the desert, finally he had a moment of luck. Mauro found a desert oasis. He threw himself into the water and drank and cooled himself off, thankful to finally have this little bit of relief. And as he enjoyed this water, he suddenly began to feel very, very sick. Because he was so dehydrated, it was very difficult to swallow the water. And when he finally managed to get it down his throat, his body immediately threw it back up, because the water was like an assault on his system at that point. And in order to prevent this shock to his system, he had to resort to taking tiny sips of water every few minutes until his body finally began to accept the water. With his thirst finally quenched after laying in the water for what seemed like hours, he replenished his water container and continued on walking, still trying to find civilization. Not long into his walk, he eventually came up to a pile of dried up sheep droppings. Looking down at these droppings, he thought to himself, if these droppings are here, then there must be more around. So he began to search for more, and then before long he found himself following a trail of sheep droppings, which eventually led him to human footprints. Ecstatic with finding these footprints, which gave him more hope than he had had since the day of the sandstorm, he looked around for anyone who may have made these tracks, and eventually he laid his eyes on a young girl who was maybe 8 years old. She was tending to the flock of sheep that he had been tracking, and Mauro had finally found his salvation. The young girl was part of a caravan of nomadic people who immediately gave him goat's milk, then loaded him up onto a camel and took him to the nearest village. Despite starting the marathon in Morocco, Mauro had traveled 180 miles from where he disappeared, unknowingly wandering into Algeria. Local military police initially confronted him due to the tensions between the two countries, but after finding out who he was, they ultimately took him to the hospital. Over the course of his ordeal, Mauro lost 35 pounds. Doctors said his liver had almost completely failed. The hospital staff gave him 16 liters of intravenous fluid. He was reunited with his family and received a warm welcome back to Italy, although he was unable to eat solid foods for several months after, and it took him at least 2 full years for his body to fully recover. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Thank you for watching, and if you haven't already, please make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our Creepyville stories. If you have any story suggestions, please leave them in the comments below, and I will see you again later.